On February the 27th, 1917, at a stretch of open ground south of Washington known as Congress Heights, a 62-year-old man from Utah set up two weapons in front of roughly 300 congressmen, senators, army officers, and foreign military attaches from France and Britain, men who had spent 3 exhausting years watching a war of machine guns grind an entire continent into trenches and were desperate to see whether America had anything useful left to bring to it. He fired both weapons without a single stoppage, cycling round after round in front of a crowd that had watched 3 years of European trench warfare turn the machine gun into a byword for jamming, overheating, and failing at exactly the moment it was needed most. Within weeks, he had a government contract, and within months, the United States Army would ask his design to do something no machine gun trial had ever asked of a weapon before: prove that a frightened soldier could take it apart and put it back together again without being able to see his own hands. This is not a story about a war that got won. It is a story about a design philosophy that outlived the man who built it, and outlived the war it was built for by roughly a century, proven not on a battlefield but in a training exercise almost nobody outside the Army ever heard of. Every week we take apart the story stamped into the steel of an American weapon, the inventor, the proving ground, and the war that finally decided whether it mattered. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. John Moses Browning was born on January the 23rd, 1855, in Ogden, Utah, the eldest son of a pioneer gunsmith named Jonathan Browning, who had crossed the frontier with the earliest Mormon settlers and set up a shop that his son later called, in effect, his real education. John spent his boyhood in that shop, handling parts before he could read, absorbing an understanding of tolerances and moving mechanisms that no formal classroom in the Utah Territory could have given him. He built his first working gun at 13. At 23, working from a design his father had reportedly challenged him to improve after watching him repair someone else's rifle, he built a falling block single-shot rifle strong and simple enough to patent, filing in May of 1879 with his father signing the application as a witness. Jonathan died the following month, 4 months before the patent was formally granted. By his mid-20s, Browning had already sold that first design to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company for $8,000, the start of a career that would eventually touch nearly every major American arms maker of his era, and by 1890, still a young man, he had turned his attention to a different problem entirely: an automatic machine gun that cycled its action using the energy of its own recoil rather than gas bled off from the barrel. He patented the idea that year. Nobody in the United States Army wanted it. The peacetime military of the late 19th century had little appetite and less budget for a heavy machine gun of any design, and Browning, ever the pragmatist, went back to designing rifles and shotguns that were actually making him money. The recoil-operated machine gun sat on a shelf, patented, proven only on paper, entirely unwanted, for 27 years, while the man who had invented it became rich and famous building almost everything except it. Those 27 years were not idle ones. Browning sold Winchester a string of lever-action rifles that became the backbone of the American sporting rifle market. Models in 1886, 1892, 1894, and 1895, along with a pump-action shotgun in 1897 that Winchester's own catalog leaned on for decades. He also sold Colt, a very different kind of automatic weapon, in the early 1890s, a gas-operated machine gun with a lever that swung down and forward beneath the barrel with every shot, earning it the nickname the potato digger among the soldiers who fired it. The Navy adopted it, and it saw service with Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders in Cuba in 1898, the first fully automatic machine gun the American military had ever purchased. It was proof, years before anyone needed proof, that the same mind capable of designing a lever-action hunting rifle for a Utah rancher could just as easily design a weapon meant to be fired at soldiers on the other side of the world. But that gas-operated design was not the recoil-operated one still gathering dust on the shelf, and by 1917 the potato diggers' numbers in active service could be counted in the low hundreds, nowhere near enough for what was coming. Those 27 shelved years were not kind to American war planning either way. When the United States formally declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, the Army's own internal accounting showed the entire nation possessed fewer than 700 aging Bennett Mercy machine guns, a few hundred obsolete Maxims, and barely more than 150 examples of that earlier potato digger design, nowhere near enough of either kind of Browning gun or any other machine gun to fight a war that 3 years of European trench fighting had already proven was, above almost everything else, a machine guns war. American commanders who had watched the Western Front from a distance understood, at least on paper, that whichever side could put more sustained, reliable automatic fire onto a battlefield held a decisive advantage. The country about to send hundreds of thousands of young men into that fight did not yet have a domestic weapon capable of giving them one. Browning, now past 60, pulled his 27-year-old design back off the shelf and, working with his son Val, brought it back to functioning condition in a matter of weeks, ready in time for the Congress Heights demonstration that February, where he showed the crowd not just the recoil-operated heavy machine gun, but a second lighter design as well, a shoulder-fired automatic rifle that would become known as the Bar. Both worked flawlessly that afternoon. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary reversal of fortune for an idea that had spent nearly 3 decades convincing absolutely nobody it was worth building. A contract was not the same as a finished weapon, and the Army, still nursing its own memories of guns that jammed, overheated, or simply failed under sustained fire in the mud of a European trench, wanted considerably more than one good afternoon before it staked American soldiers' lives on the design. Water cooling itself was by 1917 already a proven idea. The German Maxim that dominated the Western Front and the British Vickers, built on the same underlying principle, had shown years earlier that wrapping a barrel in a jacket of circulating water solved automatic fire's single biggest limitation: heat, letting a gunfire, for as long as its crew's nerve and ammunition supply held out rather than the couple of minutes an unjacketed barrel could survive before warping. What Browning brought to that already proven cooling concept was not the water jacket itself, but the mechanism driving it, an action with fewer moving parts than the Maxim's toggle lock system, fewer parts to break, foul with mud, or freeze solid in a European winter. Further trials were held at Springfield Armory that May, alongside a handful of competing designs, foreign and domestic, that the Ordnance Department had been quietly weighing for years without ever settling on a winner, designs that had never been asked to prove themselves against a genuinely urgent deadline before. It was there, not at Congress Heights, that the weapon earned the reputation that would follow it for the rest of the century. Further trials were held at Springfield Armory that May, alongside a number of competing designs the Ordnance Department had been quietly evaluating for years without settling on a winner, and it was there, not at Congress Heights, that the weapon earned the reputation that would define it for the rest of the century. Browning fired the first prototype gun for 20,000 rounds without a single malfunction. The Ordnance Board, skeptical that any production copy could match a prototype fired by its own inventor, asked for more. Browning brought out a second gun and fired it continuously for 48 minutes and 12 seconds, more than 21,000 rounds without stopping, the gun's water jacket carrying heat away from the barrel faster than the gun could generate it, long after any air-cooled design of the period would have warped its own barrel into uselessness. Across both guns, roughly 40,000 rounds were fired that week, with only a single broken part, a sear the entire time, a level of reliability nothing else at those trials came close to matching. Then the board asked for something stranger still. Impressed by how few parts the gun actually contained and how simply they fit together, the officers overseeing the trial ordered the demonstrating soldiers to strip the weapon down to its individual components and reassemble it again. blindfolded, to prove it could be serviced by a man who could not see his own hands, whether from darkness, from smoke, or from a gas attack that had fogged his mask and stung his eyes shut. The soldiers did it in minutes. Nobody had ever asked a machine gun to pass that test before because no machine gun anyone had previously trusted was simple enough to survive it. That blindfold test, born out of one afternoon of curiosity at an armory in Massachusetts, became a standard exercise at American machine gun schools for the rest of the weapon's service life, repeated by thousands of soldiers who would never know it had started as a spontaneous request from a skeptical board trying to find a way to break Browning's design and failing. That result was not an accident of one lucky prototype. Browning rarely trusted a design to paper before he had built it with his own hands and fired it enough times to find its actual weaknesses rather than its theoretical ones, a habit formed in his father's Utah shop decades earlier and never really abandoned no matter how famous or wealthy he became. Colleagues who worked alongside him in later years described a man who did not so much solve a mechanical problem as refused to stop turning it over until it gave way, counting parts obsessively, treating every unnecessary screw or spring as a future failure point waiting to happen in the hands of a soldier who would have no armorer within reach when it did. The blindfold test worked because the gun underneath it had already been designed from the very first sketch by someone who assumed the man operating it would eventually be cold, frightened, and unable to see clearly, and built accordingly. The Army adopted the weapon formally as the machine gun Browning caliber .30, model of 1917, and manufacturing contracts went out simultaneously to 3 companies at once: Colt, Remington, and New England Westinghouse, an unusual arrangement that reflected just how urgently the government needed volume rather than a single exclusive supplier, and how little confidence anyone had that one factory alone could deliver machine guns fast enough to matter. Westinghouse in particular had almost no prior experience building small arms at all. An electrical equipment manufacturer suddenly retooling part of its industrial base to machine water jackets and receiver groups to tolerances the company had never previously needed to hold. It was not urgent enough. Tooling up 3 separate factories to mass produce a complex, precision-machined, water-cooled weapon with tolerances tight enough that parts built in one state needed to interchange cleanly with parts built in another took time the front line simply did not have. While Colt, Remington, and Westinghouse worked to bring their production lines up to speed through the back half of 1917 and into 1918, American troops in France kept fighting with whatever French Hotchkiss guns they had already been issued, borrowed hardware standing in for the weapon their own country had promised them and had not yet managed to deliver. The first model of 1917 guns were not even demonstrated to American and Allied officers in France until the end of June 1918, little more than 4 months before the armistice. Of the roughly 30,000 guns that eventually crossed the Atlantic, only a small fraction, a little over 1,000, reached the front in time to fire at a living enemy before the guns finally fell silent on November the 11th, an entire industrial mobilization arriving, for most practical purposes, just barely too late to matter to the war it had been built to win. That number should, by any reasonable measure, be the end of the story. A weapon that spent almost the entire war sitting in crates in warehouses and rail yards on both sides of the Atlantic does not usually get remembered as the gun that reshaped a battlefield. But the guns that did make it to the front made an impression completely out of proportion to how few of them there were, and it is worth being precise about why. The commanding officer of a machine gun detachment attached to the Army's 78th Division reported directly to General John J. Pershing that during 5 days of action, his unit's 4 model of 1917 guns had fired approximately 13,000 rounds, sustained, reliable, uninterrupted fire that no air-cooled gun of the period could have matched without burning out its own barrel. The weapon saw its heaviest use during the Meuse-Argonne offensive that autumn, the largest and bloodiest American operation of the entire war. A 47-day grinding advance through dense forest and fortified German positions that cost more American lives than any other battle in the nation's history, fought by more than 1 million American soldiers under General Pershing's direct command in the campaign that finally broke German resistance on the Western Front. In that kind of fighting, the ability to lay down sustained defensive fire for minutes at a time, not seconds, mattered as much as any rifle or artillery piece on the line, holding a captured position against counterattack, breaking up a German assault before it could close to grenade range, buying the minutes an advancing unit needed to dig in before the next wave came. German machine gunners, working the belt-fed, water-cooled Maxim design that had already defined trench warfare for 3 years, found themselves facing an American gun built on the same fundamental cooling principle but mechanically simpler to strip, maintain, and keep firing under exactly the kind of sustained pressure the offensive demanded. Val Browning himself crossed the Atlantic that autumn to personally instruct American soldiers on how to use his father's design in the field, an inventor's son standing in French mud teaching other men's sons the same blindfold discipline that had first been demonstrated back home at Springfield only months earlier. The war ended 6 weeks after that first demonstration in France. The model of 1917 never got the years of combat testing that the German Maxim or the British Vickers had already accumulated by 1918. Years earned in trenches, this gun mostly missed. What it got instead was something arguably more consequential: an entire post-war American army built around the assumption that this specific mechanism, and the training discipline built around it, was now the standard against which every future American machine gun would be measured. That assumption was not automatic. Post-war military budgets across the 1920s were thin, funding for new weapons programs was scarce, and the temptation for any peacetime army is to simply stop thinking about the last war's hardware at all. Instead, the Ordnance Department spent those lean years refining what it already had, rather than chasing something new, running officer after officer through the same blindfold discipline, writing manuals around the same tripod and water jacket, effectively betting the next war on a design that had barely gotten to prove itself in the one just finished. Through the 1920s and 30s, the model of 1917 remained the United States Army's principal heavy machine gun, the weapon every new officer trained on, and the blindfold test remained the exercise every new machine gunner learned it by, a small ritual repeated in armories across the country by soldiers who had no idea it traced back to one afternoon of curiosity in Massachusetts. In the late 1930s, it was updated to the model of 1917A1, a faster rate of fire and small mechanical refinements, and in that form it went to war again in nearly every theater of the Second World War, from North Africa to Normandy to the island campaigns of the Pacific, carried by a generation of soldiers whose fathers had never gotten the chance to fire it in anger at all, dug into defensive perimeters on Pacific atolls and hauled ashore on the same beaches their father's generation had only read about. American troops carried it into Korea, where the same water jacket that had carried heat away from a barrel in the Argonne forest now did the same job in temperatures that dropped low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. South Vietnamese forces were still firing it in the 1960s, more than 4 decades after Browning first pulled his old patent back off the shelf. A weapon designed for one trench war still being carried into a jungle war its inventor could never have imagined. The same recoil-operated action, lightened and made air-cooled, became the M1919 machine gun of the Second World War, and scaled up to .50 caliber, it became the M2 Browning, a weapon still in active American military service today, mounted on vehicles and aircraft on nearly every continent, more than a century after its inventor first patented the underlying idea in a world that had absolutely no use for it yet. Original model of 1917 machine guns, particularly examples with documented combat history from units like the 78th Division, are today among the most sought-after pieces in American machine gun collecting, a market where the paperwork proving a specific gun's wartime service matters as much as the metal itself, and where the difference between a gun that sat in a warehouse in New Jersey for the entire war and a gun that fired 13,000 rounds during the Meuse-Argonne offensive can be the difference between a curiosity and a museum piece. Complete deactivated, water-jacketed examples with matching tripods routinely sell for tens of thousands of dollars to collectors and museums who understand exactly what they are paying for, not just a machine gun, but the specific machine gun that convinced the United States Army what a machine gun was supposed to be, decades before anyone had heard of Normandy, Incheon, or Khe Sanh. This is not a story about a war that got won by one weapon. It is a story about a design philosophy, simple enough to survive being handled blindfolded by a frightened man in the dark, that outlived the man who built it, outlived the war it barely arrived in time to join, and quietly became the standard every American machine gun since has had to answer to. John Moses Browning did not live to see most of what his recoil-operated design would go on to do. He died in 1926 at a workbench in Belgium, still designing weapons for a company on the other side of the ocean, more than 2 decades before the last model of 1917-01 was finally retired from active American service. He never commanded troops, never wore a uniform in the war his design helped equip, and never stood in the Argonne mud watching what his mechanism could actually do under fire. His son did that for him. Somewhere in an American military training manual today, decades after the last model of 1917 was retired from active service, the same underlying discipline. Browning's design, first proved at Springfield in 1917, still shapes how American soldiers are taught to trust their equipment, strip it, know it completely enough that darkness or smoke or panic cannot stop their hands from finding the next part in sequence. It did not have long to prove itself in the war it was built for. Barely 6 weeks, by the most honest count, out of a war that lasted 56 months, a war that was already over before most of the 30,000 guns built for it ever left their crates. It did not need long. Every American machine gun built since, water-cooled or air-cooled, 30 caliber or 50, mounted on a tripod or a helicopter or a Humvee, has been arguing Browning's case for him, one blindfolded reassembly at a time, in a training exercise nobody remembers was ever meant to be a test. If you want more stories about the inventors who quietly reshape the way America fights its wars, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.